This episode is brought to you in part by the Apologetics Guy Show, the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about Christianity. Learn to explain your faith with courage and compassion. Join Moody Bible Institute professor Dr. Mikel Del Rosario at apologeticsguy.com.
This episode is part of a long series exploring how some evangelicals in the United States tied themselves to the Republican Party in the 1970s and 80s. It's also the second part of a two-part series. You're going to want to go back one episode before listening to this one because there are some big terms here that I explained in the last show. Hey, buddy, how's it going?
Hey, good. How about you?
Okay. Thank you for doing something so ridiculous. My friend Mike is one of the nicest, funniest, warmest people I've ever met. And growing up, he only got to watch a few channels. One of them was PBS. I'm here joined with my brother Nick Starin.
Hello, everyone.
Talking to one of our very favorite people in the world. Mike, you had an interesting relationship with television in your early days. What was available to you as a child?
Oh, yeah. So we had the bunny ears on the TV. So I grew up around Buffalo, New York, just outside of Buffalo, New York. We didn't have cable, so it was just whatever stations we could get from the antenna, which was our NBC, CBS, ABC, and PBS. Luckily, some public Canadian stations, too, I was lucky to get. So public television was my television experience growing up.
What are we talking about as far as public television programs you were watching?
I'm sure you guys remember Thomas the Tank Engine. There was Shining Time Station was something that was on PBS, which kind of had little excerpts about Thomas the Tank Engine, but also was all about like this station where all the people lived in. There was Arthur on PBS. Oh my goodness.
Arthur.
Yeah. So Arthur was actually my favorite musicians are Simon and Garfunkel, and I learned about Art Garfunkel from an episode of Arthur, where Art Garfunkel stars.
Because he's such a secret. That's right.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, when I tell you my childhood was sheltered, I didn't learn about Art Garfunkel until PBS told me about it.
This is deep in the era of MTV as well, which I think is funny. So you were watching VJs,
true, yeah.
you know.
Yeah, high vocal harmonies were not allowed in my household. I mean, my life was changed. All thanks to PBS.
Wow. Was Red Green on PBS?
Oh, absolutely.
Or was that Canadian? I can't remember.
It was on PBS, and it was also on CBC up in Canada. So I picked it up from both public stations, basically.
How would you describe Red Green?
Oh, my gosh. Oh, like, just an everyman. He was... he was and is kind of what especially every bachelor strives to be, making dinner and eating it over your kitchen sink, and then just anything that goes wrong in your house, you fix it yourself. The camaraderie of men from the Possum Lodge of Red Green. In fact, one of the first conversations we ever had when I first moved in with you was we talked about Red Green, and I'm like, wait, let me show you. And I pull out my wallet, and I had my Possum Lodge membership card from the Red Green show.
We knew we would be friends forever.
Yeah, forever. Absolutely.
PBS, the old home of Sesame Street and Reading Rainbow. But PBS has also hosted other programs that shaped the United States, including William F. Buckley's conservative talk show, Firing Line, a program that featured guests like Phyllis Schlafly, or Sir Kenneth Clark's 13-part series called Civilization, which angered some Christians so much that it sparked the filming of Francis Schaeffer's How Should We Then Live? It was also the home of a different kind of series, one designed to nudge Americans toward a vision of free market economics, free to choose. One where a charismatic, bald economist with a knowing smile preached the gospel of laissez-faire, at the same time implying some uncomfortable ideas about schools and race. It was January of 1980, only a few months before Ronald Reagan won the presidential election, and Milton Friedman was coming to just about every living room in the country. You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Starin, and this is Truce. I'll be right back after these messages. It's hard to imagine, but in January of 1980, PBS aired 10 one-hour episodes of a show featuring, of all things, an economist. You can watch clips of Friedman's PBS specials titled Free to Choose for free on YouTube. But before you do, think about how wild it is to build a show around an academic. Can you name a single living economics professor in the United States today? Probably not. But here was one with his own PBS show, taking his gospel of free markets to the masses. Ironically, though, through a network partially funded with government money. The show is very visual. The crew traveled around the world gathering beautiful footage. But tucked neatly inside is classic monetarism and free market economics. For example, in an episode on education, he argues that students at private colleges worked harder than those at public schools because they paid higher tuition and, thus, valued their education more. That's pretty reductionist, but there it is. In his episode, What's Wrong with Our Schools?, they transition from talking about a little African-American girl to a black tie fundraiser where a wealthy Japanese donor is displaying traditional art. What follows is an actor recreating Milton Friedman's narration from Free to Choose.
Children like Ava are being shortchanged, but there are ways to give all parents more say over their children's schooling. This is a fundraising evening for schools, supported by a voluntary organization, New York's Inner City Scholarship Fund. The prints that have brought people here have been loaned by a wealthy Japanese industrialist. Events like this have helped raise $2 million to help finance Catholic parochial schools in New York. The people here are part of a long American tradition. The results of their private, voluntary activities are remarkable.
He extols the virtue of funding schools through the benevolence of wealthy donors, instead of, tax dollars. You too can finance your private schools if you can get your hands on some Japanese art. The program emphasizes letting parents choose where their kids will go to school.
This is one of the poorest neighborhoods in New York City, the Bronx. Yet, this parochial school, supported by the fund, is a joy to visit. The youngsters here, from poor families, are at St. John's Christensen's because their parents have picked this school, and their parents are paying some of the costs from their own pockets. The children are well behaved, eager to learn, and the teachers are dedicated.
Okay, so you haven't heard my upcoming episodes on school choice or forced busing yet, but remember this when we get there. These films were produced in the late 1970s and aired at the dawn of the 80s. That's significant because schooling made front-page headlines then, as there were arguments about white and black students being bused in order to integrate schools. Some of the resistance to the integration process used language about a parent's right to choose. Yes, many of the children shown in this school, funded by wealthy donors and parents who can afford to send their kids to them, are black. But, is there a chance that there's some subtext here? As we learned in the last episode, Friedman opposed the Civil Rights Act because he thought it impinged on freedom to discriminate. Now here he is dancing around how we finance education. Friedman liked the idea of school vouchers. Schools in the U.S. receive funding in part based on the number of students they have. The voucher system would let parents take that amount of money with them to whatever school they chose.
Yes, it actually probably originated with John Stuart Mill,
another economist.
This was a really sort of signature Friedman move to think about if we have a government policy or program or bureaucracy or structure, how instead of a new institution could we use prices and choice in a market framework to get the job done instead.
This is Stanford professor Jennifer Burns, the author of Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative. If you listen to the last episode, you'll remember Friedman's objections to the Federal Reserve. Why have a whole government agency when you can just set the rate of new money coming into the system at 4% and be done with it? He wanted to do something similar with schools. Why control where kids go when we can let the market decide?
So in this context, instead of having government funded and run and organized schools, why don't you give the money for those to parents and let them use that money in the marketplace to provide education for their children?
At first glance, it sounds pretty benign. But there may be some objectionable notions lurking beneath the surface, because ideas like this don't spring out of nowhere. They exist within the context of their time and place. He posited this thought experiment the year before Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court case that demanded integration of schools.
It then got a very big boost in the context of Brown versus Board of Education, as many Southern white parents were really looking for any way to evade the integration mandates. And what was pretty troubling from my perspective, at least, was that Friedman decided he was okay with whoever used his voucher idea for whatever purpose. So he said, it's okay, I'm fine with that. He just kind of stood by the idea.
The problem with the voucher system is that it would provide funding to segregationalist schools that kept out black people, which is, of course, why racists like the idea. If the voucher system were enacted, it would not only allow them to send their kids to segregated private schools, parents could use government funding to pay for it. In the 1970s, the government cracked down on segregated schools that refused to integrate, some of which were religious institutions. The goal was to tear down the wall of separation and bring kids together of all different races in public schools. To fight this, some parents sent their kids to private schools, thus working around Brown v. Board of Education. The voucher system would, among other things, effectively fund segregation. Right now, I'm just quickly summarizing this whole issue. We'll spend more time on it later. But I wanted you to see that Friedman was one of the earliest people to propose this workaround. What he called freedom was easily manipulated into tax-supported racism. Also, this whole Japanese print thing from Free to Choose neatly ties into my episode with Jesse Eisinger from ProPublica. There's a sense among some wealthy people, and I've heard this from their own mouths, that they shouldn't have to pay taxes like the rest of us. Instead, they argued that they should be allowed to use their wealth to do whatever they see fit. Friedman seems to agree with them. Let wealthy people fund the schools. But do we really want our society to rely on the whims of billionaires who use their wealth to gain leverage in our communities? To allow them to potentially threaten to defund our schools if they don't get their way? Now listen, this is an episode of Truce. It's way more complicated than just basic racism and wealthy people flexing their muscle.
There's another history of the vouchers, though, which is that they have also been taken up by the African American community to try to escape failing schools. And there's a kind of progressive history of promoting school choice and school vouchers, that also continues to this day. So it's definitely a contested policy, but it's one of those things. Yeah, he just kind of wrote a paper about it, it wasn't like his major area of research at all. And it really changed a lot of the dynamics of public education and changed many students' lives.
The docuseries then takes us to a storefront school in Harlem, where teachers, some of them without degrees, are teaching students. Friedman extols the virtues of this school, saying that it only went downhill when they started accepting tax money and teachers had to be accredited. He wasn't keen on all kinds of licensing for careers. Under free market logic, if a teacher is bad,
forget about it. You don't need to know algebra.
And the parents then had to choose to move schools to get away from them.
Come on, kids, get in the car. There's better schools in Chicago.
That teacher would eventually run out of demand for their services and be fired.
I was so bad at my job, I don't have any students left. That's just math.
Of course, that would mean parents would have to know each teacher's abilities on a granular level.
Excuse me, Mrs. Phillips, why do you do nap time before snack time?
Meaning, potentially, keeping track of dozens of individual teachers for a family with multiple kids.
We've got a pretty serious spreadsheet going.
It sounds good until you start thinking about what that would mean on a practical level. Episodes of Friedman's TV show were funded by organizations like General Mills, Bechtel, and General Motors. I bring that up because I'll soon drop an episode about how big business pushed laissez-faire economics in the 1970s and 80s. Why? To increase their bottom lines, they financed public media campaigns, and no doubt got a tax write-off for doing so. And this PBS show is a prime example. Free to Choose is well produced, but underlying it are deep cracks. Not every parent can afford private schools. Also, pulling kids from public schools defunds them, decreasing the amount of money available, thus making them weaker and possibly sending them into a spiral from which they can never recover. So if an already underfunded rural or urban school loses more money, it may not be able to evolve. Friedman lifts up the Japanese economy as free market, but neglects to mention that it was established by a leader with a communist bent. He attributes India's economic hardships of that era to an overzealous government, skipping over 2 centuries of British rule. Not to mention never stopping to let people ask if they want their kids going to schools that are taught by people without degrees. He seems to have thought that the answer to every societal question was deregulate. Keep the government out whenever possible. Is he one of those guys that he was a hammer and so every problem he saw was a nail, and that he used economics to try to address every issue?
Yeah, I mean that's a way to say it. He had this framework. He prized consistency. He prized logical reasoning and give and take. He prized argument and debate. And he just really didn't see limits to this framework. And what was really interesting for me is that one of his teachers at the University of Chicago was a man named Frank Knight. And Knight was always saying, don't do this. Like, sure, you could use economic analysis to analyze anything, but it wouldn't be a very good analysis. You need history, you need culture, you need art. You need to incorporate all these other modes of thought and aspects of human life in order to make good decisions. And Friedman basically was like, no, I disagree. Just sort of set aside those limitations and decided to take it as far as he could.
That was Friedman. Cut corporate taxes, keep the money supply steady, deregulate industry, allow Americans to do whatever they want to do so long as they're not hurting anyone. At least, not directly. Importantly, cut back on government intervention in the economy, unlike John Maynard Keynes, who was all for it. One of the most striking things about researching Friedman is discovering elements of his philosophy that would shock modern conservatives who cite him, like his belief in a universal income.
What is important to note is Friedman saw this as an alternative to the existing welfare state. So it wasn't an add-on, it was a replacement. And he was pretty remarkably distinct. It's pretty unique in that he didn't believe there should be litmus tests for the receipt of this money other than an income threshold. So he didn't believe there should be a work requirement. He didn't believe in his day there were, in a different moral culture, there were rules about like having a man in the house. If you were receiving welfare and they discovered a man's hat, if you were a woman, unmarried woman receiving welfare, with children receiving welfare, they discovered a man's hat in your house, which they would come and inspect. They would cut you off welfare because you had another source of income, they would allege. And so Friedman thought this is too invasive, violations of privacy, violations of freedom. You should just say, look, if your income is below, X amount of dollars per year, you get this cash benefit. And he felt like that would limit the size of government because it would be much easier to do that one benefit rather than to have all these different programs with eligibility and bureaucracies and workers to figure out who's eligible and having to file paperwork and all of this sort of thing. Friedman was, allied with Republicans. In many ways, he was a conservative, but he did not fear this idea that giving people money would make them lazy or they would get something they didn't deserve. He just didn't think in those terms.
So yeah, a big difference between Friedman and modern conservatives. Or even Ronald Reagan, who ran on stories of quote-unquote welfare queens, people who were rumored to make a fortune on America's welfare system. By and large, what we now think of as Reaganomics were basically Friedman's ideas. The two men differed on ideas ranging from how to help poor people to the ballooning national debt created by Reagan's increased spending and decreased taxes. God willing, we'll get there too. What does this have to do with evangelicals? Well, I'm glad you asked. The pro-Reagan evangelical guys lapped this stuff up. Evangelicals don't have, say, a pope who makes sweeping decisions for us. That's why I hesitate to say that evangelical leaders advocated laissez-faire economics, because we don't technically have leaders. At least not in the national or global sense. Really, these guys were just people with big followings who had access to power. Okay, let's demonstrate that some of these guys loved Friedman. This is by no means an exhaustive list. Exhibit A. Listen, America! I yelled that because there's an exclamation point at the end of the title. Listen, comma, America, exclamation point. It's begging to be yelled. On page 61 of my copy, he quotes Friedman's book, Free to Choose, writing that government spending has gone way up since the New Deal. Then Falwell writes this.
Belief in individual responsibility, laissez-faire, and a decentralized and limited government changed to belief in social responsibility and a centralized and powerful government. Friedman points out that Roosevelt's advisors were ready to view the Depression as a failure of capitalism.
What does he blame for the economic woes of the late 70s? The New Deal. Exhibit B. In the 1970s, the National Association of Evangelicals adopted a position that federal spending should be capped to a certain fixed amount compared to GDP and should be required to balance the budget. Their citation? A paper whose foreword was written by Milton Friedman. A drive to limit the size of government by crimping the spending? Yeah, that's Milton Friedman. Exhibit C. The Christian Voice was an organization we won't likely cover in detail because this season is already very long. It was an organization organized by New Right guys Paul Weyrich, Terry Dolan, Howard Phillips, and Richard Viguerie to train evangelicals to get involved in elections. They sent out a mailing with the help of Jerry Falwell, which stated,
"We're tired of seeing the federal government trample all over our time-honored and sacred Christian values. We're tired of seeing our nation's wealth squandered on crazy, vote-buying welfare schemes, and of seeing our sustenance being destroyed by inflation and big government spending. We want to return to the old values of hard work, thrift, and obedience to the laws of God. In other words, we want our country back."
I'll say it a few times this season because I really want you to think about this. Much of what bonded some evangelicals to the Republican Party has to do with money. Yes, there are other issues from racism to movements against feminism, modernists, gays and lesbians, and a shift towards Christian nationalism. But too many resources skip over this crucial fact. A lot of this is about money, taxes, fear that government programs are eroding our freedom. Despite all of the Bible's stark warnings about wealth, it is a key part of the process of bonding some evangelicals to the GOP. And who do these movements cite? Milton Friedman. Actually, a mishmash of ideas from trickle-down economics, Friedman, and a bunch of other sources. But Friedman for sure. It's not my goal to tell you which economic model is best, or to convince you of a certain policy. I just want you to consider where your biases come from. Be aware of them. What is your real beef with taxes? Is it the amount? The number of different taxes? Or is it the difficulty in calculating and paying them? How did you feel during my previous episode with Jesse Eisinger when we discussed how the ultra-wealthy avoid taxes? Who told you that social programs for the poor are bad or good? And why do you believe that? What is the role of money in the life of a Christian? Why do we choose to believe only in dichotomies? It's either free market capitalism or socialism. Why do we so rarely talk about capitalism that is appropriately regulated? Friedman is an icon and someone who gets a lot of blame. Both are probably deserved. His message to the world, "Freedom is my God," lingers over sectors of society even 50 years after it was uttered, 40-ish years after his PBS show premiered. As the season continues, listen for his influence. When it comes down to what to think about Milton Friedman and his legacy, I'll just assume that, like the title of his show, you're free to choose. This episode took a ton of work. Jennifer Burns was a big help. Her book again is Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative. I owe a lot of thanks to the book Reaganland by Rick Perlstein and a variety of articles from Investopia.com. I'll have links to those on the website. Other help came from Freedom and Capitalism by Milton Friedman, of course, and Listen, America by Jerry Falwell. The early part of the first episode about the Depression was heavily influenced by Robert Caro's book, The Path to Power, which is one of the finest books I've ever read. More sources are in your show notes and on the website. Special thanks to everyone who loaned me their voices for this episode, including Dave Monroe, Bob Stevenson, and Lauren Fry. This podcast is produced by me. Usually a show that is this complex requires a staff of people, and that's my goal someday. If you want more interesting, in-depth coverage like this, why not help me out? Visit trucepodcast.com/donate for more information. Truce is a production of Truce Media, LLC. God willing, we'll talk again soon. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce.